Thank you very much, Rochelle. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm Mandana Khalili, Professor of Medicine, Director of the UCSF Research Coordinating Center's Investigator Development Unit for the NIMHD Health Excellence Action Network. I'd like to welcome you to our monthly training webinar. And before we start, I wanted to share that we are honored to have Dr. Jude Mikal here with us speak on I've Got My Pilot Data, Now What? And this is about how to leverage pilot data for a successful grant application. Dr. Mikal is a senior research fellow at in the Pharmaceutical Care and Health Services Division of the University of Minnesota College of Pharmacy. He's also a co-investigator of the Investigator Development Core for the C2 Dream Center since 2021. He develops and delivers educational programming for grant writing and to nurture the next generation of health researchers. His own research explores their increasingly complex role of social media as a determinant, a byproduct, and an indicator of health status. During this presentation, please don't hesitate to ask questions either through raising your hand or through the chat function. And Dr. Mikal will be happy to address these questions along the way. And also we will have some time at the end of the presentation as well for questions. Dr. Mikal, welcome, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thanks. Yeah. So I'm excited to be here, and thank you to everybody for showing up. I know it's Friday and the summertime for most of us. So I appreciate you all being here. I love it. I love it when cameras are on, so no pressure. And there are lots of filters if your room's messy, but I do like to see faces because I like to see if people are kind of getting it. So if you don't mind turning on your camera, great. If you'd prefer to keep it off, I totally understand. But yeah, it helps me to feel like I'm speaking to a full, to a full human. Dr. Khalili said, I am doing this. This was at the request of the pilot scholars in our Minnesota C2 Dream consortium. A lot of the pilot scholars, we asked the pilot scholars, what are some of the things that you struggle with as you're beginning your sort of grant writing career? And one of the big things that came up is how do we transition from the pilot project to larger federal funded initiatives? And I was just telling Rochelle sort of before we started, one of the things was, I didn't quite know what to include. I went to sit down and to make the slides, excuse me. I went to sit down and to make the slides, and I wasn't sure which pieces were giving people trouble. So the first thing that we did is we sat down with all the pilot scholars in the C2 Dream sort of pilot scholar cadre and asked them, what is it that you're struggling with? What would you like to know more about? And these were some of the themes that came up. And so what we'll do today is we'll look at, first off, what is pilot data? And I know it seems pretty self-evident, but we're going to go through it anyway, because I think it includes more than what people often anticipate. Second is navigating that transition from small and local to large and national grants, where to include pilot data within your grant proposal, what to include in the actual write-up of the pilot data, because there are a lot of ways to do it, and then highlighting opportunities for growth and rigor from your pilot data to the larger project, and then maybe look at some examples, although I'm not sure we'll have a ton of time for that because I do want to leave plenty of time at the end for questions. And as Dr. Khalili said, please feel free to interrupt at any time. Use the hand raise feature and I'll stop what I'm talking about and we can chat about what you're interested in, or you can ask a question in the chat and I'll try to weave it in sort of to what we're talking about at the moment. So what is pilot data? I think none of you would be surprised to know that pilot data are the preliminary results generated from small scale studies, but it can also include smaller pieces of larger studies that you've done. So oftentimes, and you'll notice this with successful researchers, is like, you have what you've told the NIH that you're going to collect data on. You have your large scale sort of flagship project that maybe goes along with your R01, but a lot of times people will add in certain questions to a survey, or, I think oftentimes what younger investigators are surprised to know is you often end up with a lot more data than you can use and write up in an R01 project or even in a pilot project. Once you've collected the qualitative data, the survey data, or downloaded all of the, big data, whatever type of big data that you're using, you often end up with more than what you can use. And it's often in downloading or collecting more data than you can use or than you need that you end up with this sort of repository of sort of latent information, right? Latent discovery. And so I think a lot of what people don't know is like a lot of this stuff can be data that's just lying around. Data sets that you've generated for one project that might serve for another project, and that might actually propel you a couple steps forward ahead of somebody who would be starting this sort of de novo. So it can be parts of smaller scale or larger scale studies designed to assess feasibility, refine methods, estimate parameters, and inform the development of a larger, fully powered research project. The other thing to know is that the purpose of pilot data is really, and this will come up a lot as we talk, is really to reduce a reviewer's perception of the risk of your proposal. And I think it's kind of funny because this is like shaking my fist at the NIH, because I get really, really bothered because they want like high risk transformative research. But what I think they want is low risk transformative research. And so the more that you can do to ensure that you're likely to find what you're setting out to find, but it's still going to have a big impact on the field, I think the more likely your proposal is to be funded, because it has to sort of pass the sniff test with a bunch of researchers who are, if you're sort of stepping to the side of a lot of really well-worn paths in a particular subject, are going to want to see what evidence that you have that this novel direction is likely to yield the impact that you're looking for. Does that make sense so far? So far, so good. Okay, good, I see. Couple of head nods. So you want to demonstrate the potential of a researcher in a project and show methodological feasibility and proof of concept. Those are largely the same thing. Oops. So when you use the design feature on PowerPoint, it like puts the text on one side and then the other, so I keep having to move you guys from one side of the screen to the other. Anyways, so there are different, the purpose of this slide is like a lot of what our pilot scholars were curious about is like, how do you know when you have enough? How do you know when you have too much pilot data? And the reality, I would say, not the sad reality, the reality is that like this is going to be largely dependent on what you're going after, and largely dependent on a lot of pragmatics. Like, I think that there's not an easy way to say, oh, okay, like here you are, you did it, like you have enough pilot data. I think, I've seen projects, well, in any case, let's start this way. There are different mechanisms, specifically, we're gonna relate all of this to the NIH. This is true of a lot of different funding agencies, but for simplicity's sake, we'll stay with the NIH. But there are a lot of different mechanisms, and the amount of pilot data that you're expected to have for something like an R03, so I think those are $50,000 in direct costs for 2 years, total of $100,000 direct costs. That's going to be a lot smaller than what you'd be expected to have for like an R01, which is $500,000, right? So when you're going after something much larger, the expectation is that that investment in your research is going to yield what you're proposing it's going to yield. I don't think you're off the hook for pilot data for an R03 or an R21. I just think that the expectation is a lot smaller because the investment in the research is a lot smaller. But I will say that one of the things that sort of was a little bit striking to me as I began my career in both grant writing and grant review is that researchers really rarely move from like a pilot to the results and write-up of that pilot to the NIH proposal based on that pilot. Like that's the need. That's like, if you were writing it up for a paper, that's how you would make it look. But I think it's rarely how it happens. Research is messy, and so is grant writing. Like it just is kind of like it's a mirror for everything that you deal with in research. And so oftentimes what you're doing is you're submitting a proposal, right? And maybe you submit the RO1 like right out of the gate, maybe knowing that it's not going to get accepted its first time through, but you want to get the feedback, you want to see how the idea does, you want to see if there are any fatal flaws. And one of the comments that you get is, we need more pilot data. And you kind of can anticipate that, because you're always going to need pilot data for an RO1. And so what you do is you extract a small part of your RO1, you apply for some smaller pot of money, you start to run the data collection for that smaller pilot project. You can start to put together a data set, start to use some of the measurement tools or concepts or methods or targeting specific populations. And you can use all of the things that you've learned in this sort of smaller pilot that you began post RO1 submission, right? Like that's okay. Sometimes we submit, sometimes we have the pilot funding and a great RFA comes out. That's a little dated, but we're just gonna run with it. A great request for proposals comes out, and it's so in line with your research that even though you're not done with the pilot project, you're gonna say, all right, we've got enough. We've collected enough data that we can demonstrate some clear proof of concept, some clear teeth to the idea or to the intervention or to the research that we're running. And so we're just going to run with it, right? We're going to take what we have, even though it's not entirely completed, and we're going to use that to bolster or to de-risk the larger project. Does that make sense so far? Like what I feel bad for sometimes is like when we do grant writing education, sometimes we can do like the pie in the sky idea of like how this should all run. And we love the idea that it should run in this particular way where you have a small project, you get the results, and then you do the big project, but it often doesn't run like that. And I think what we need sometimes as younger researchers is permission to do it our own way. And as a reviewer, I've been on study section for probably 5 years. And for me, I just don't balk much at the pilot data section. I'm much more curious, like, what did you do? What have you done? Like, what can you tell me about what you've done that de-risks this proposal and makes me feel like you're going to be successful? Like, I'm not so stringent on what it is. I just want to see that it's got some promise. You know what I mean? So that's where I start as a reviewer. So now with some of the basic housekeeping out of the way, we'll get to kind of the point of why we're here, which is how do we use that pilot data once we've collected it? Poop. So my strategy is this, and I think that we all as researchers could do this pretty well with our own research topics, right? When you propose something new, you can kind of take a little bit of an inventory to say, what is it that reviewers are going to be like, can you really do that? You know what I mean? Like, maybe there's some methodological piece that you think is going to raise some eyebrows. Maybe there's a new way of measuring something. Maybe you're going to access a population. Whenever you're proposing something new, right, there's some piece of the new thing that you go, this is probably where reviewers are going to kind of like squint their eyes and cock their head and, kind of look sidewise at. So I think that one of the best exercises for us is to kind of identify where those spaces are in our own research. So that's what we can set as our targets. Those are what we can set as our targets for bolstering. Does that make sense? So if your proposal is you're gonna access, hard to reach populations or vulnerable populations, you're going to work with community organizations. Like, sometimes really is about making sure that you can demonstrate that you've done work with these community organizations before. If you're going to collect data, if you're going to look for a particular like biological phenomenon, in blood tests that have previously been done through PET scans, right? You're going to want to sort of like identify, right? These are the big departures from the status quo. So think maybe about your innovation section, what's really innovative in your research, and how can you demonstrate that despite being innovative, it's still plausibly successful. From there, I think you can divide those into several different elements. Like one is conceptual readiness. If you're using novel concepts, theories, or interventions, how does your pilot data demonstrate clear proof of concept and potential for success? Methods is the same thing, right? If you're using novel data, measures, or methods, can your pilot data support the use of those tools in other related contexts? This is a big one for people. A lot of people, we're using this novel, we're using these novel methods, these novel data. It's never been used before, which is something that I really dislike reading in proposals, because oftentimes it's just been used in a different context. And sometimes we do better saying we're standing on the shoulders. It's like what is the Google Scholar, stand on the shoulders of giants. Like we want to demonstrate that we're not having a conversation that no one else is having. We're bringing a conversation from a different field into our field to add nuance, to add dimension, to sort of overcome the barriers that currently exist in our own fields. Does that make sense? Okay. It's going to be anticipatable logistical challenges, like, do you speak the language of the community that you're working with? Like, you can do, or like, do you have access to those populations? Do you have community contacts? When collecting data, is like dumb things, like, is the response burden too high? Right? If you're going to have people come in for blood tests and then sit for like a 2-hour interview and then complete a survey, like if you're proposing something that's going to like run the gamut in terms of like the type of data that you're going to be able to collect, do you have, enough people who've sat for that data collection procedure, a proportion of, maybe reached out to 50 people and all 50 said yes and all 50 completed everything. That's pretty good proof of concept that you're not going to run into any anticipatable logistical challenges. Same thing for funding readiness, right? Does your pilot data support the resources you're requesting are commensurate with the promise of forward progress, right? So did you accomplish with your pilot funding something that's commensurate with the amount of resources that you had to do this project with? So, but one of the things too, not all projects will have pilot data for all 4 elements. Not all projects will have all 4 elements. Like, how can I say that? Not everything is going to be both conceptually and methodologically innovative or novel or sort of crazy or out in left field. So it might be that you're much more in the conceptual space. Your innovations are much more in the conceptual space. If you're using a regression, you don't need a pilot project that says, we can use a regression. Like, that's okay. Tuck that to the side and really focus on those big question marks for your project. Procedurally, what does this look like? So for me, what it ultimately looks like is compiling a list of those eyebrow-raising concepts. Something that appears novel or risky, and then indexing all of the pilot and preliminary data that I have to demonstrate that I've successfully studied, deployed, or published on each feature of interest in the past. So take all the crazy concepts, all the new stuff, all the innovations, all the things that are likely to raise eyebrows, and then index what you have to de-risk those elements of your proposal. Where have you used this method successfully in the past? Where have you used this concept or this measurement strategy in the past? Where have you accessed this population in the past? What about what you have already done shows us that this is feasible? One of the things that I think is really important too, and this kind of goes back to something that I said earlier, is ultimately, I think we can be really narrow in our conceptualization of pilot data or preliminary data. I had one scholar on a grant that I was reviewing be like, well, I can't use that, it's not published. And I was like, I think you can. I think it's okay. I think you can. And she's like, no, you can't. And I was like, I think you can. I think you can because you can't. I mean, imagine it's a data set, right? I mean, that can go into preliminary data. Like you're producing stuff all the time. You guys are all scholars in your respective fields. You're all breaking new ground in your respective fields. You're all doing exciting and innovative things. And as you're sort of doing those things, new questions are arising about how to make sense of your field and how to catapult your field forward. And so you're doing things like collecting these novel data sets that if you just had one more variable, right? Or if you just had one more, comparative population, or if you just had, you could break new ground in new directions. And so of course you can use the data that you collected from an old project to catapult you forward in a new project. And it's the same thing. So one of the things that I tell people all the time, if the best you can do is I have data and I'm going, like my preliminary work is going to be, here is the data that I have, and here are some, here's a catalog of the features of that data. How many women, how many men, how many, Native American, how many white, you can use that in your pilot preliminary data. But yeah, oftentimes we run preliminary results on data that we have just lying around to say, we don't have this published yet. And I think saying something's published and having it not be published is a problem. But, we don't have this published yet, or in progress, you can write. But, these are some things that, preliminary data that we captured for a different project is telling us may be more important than we previously thought. And I think having that, in your arsenal really does help to sort of bring down the risk profile of your project. You can also use I use qualitative stuff all the time. I feel like as a reviewer, sometimes like it's so dry, like I need to drink water while I'm reading grant proposals. So sometimes I'm like, it'd be nice to breathe a little life in there and be like, what does a person think about this? What does a stakeholder think about this? What does the physician who will be using this dashboard? Dashboards are all the rage right now. What is a researcher or a physician who might be using this dashboard think about having access to a dashboard? Do they trust it? Those are exciting and fun things for me to read as a qualitative researcher, to know that you've engaged with stakeholders enough to know how people feel about what you're doing. Population pools, community partnerships. I say this: if it speaks to the feasibility and potential success of your project, shop it around to colleagues, right? Just because it hasn't been used yet doesn't mean it can't be used. Or just because you haven't seen it used doesn't mean it can't be used. You don't want to go too crazy, right? It can't be like your kid's painting. But it can be if you think about it and you kind of talk to colleagues about it, and what do you think about this? And do you think, and that's I think a totally underutilized resource in grant writing is hey, neighbor down the hall, what would you think if I were to use X, Y, and Z as part of my pilot project? Getting the feedback on that from your colleagues who are down the hall, who look exactly like the people who are going to be reviewing your projects, totally underutilized. Especially now that people are working remotely so much. I think some of the water cooler stuff, I understand all the complications of office blah blah blah, but I do think that having colleagues in and around you to shop these kind of creative harebrained ideas around that you have, to see that they maybe have more traction than you would have thought, is a godsend, really, when pitching new ideas. I don't know how many slides I have, and I don't know what slide I'm on, but
Jude,
be sure to,
can I ask
yeah,
you a question?
please.
I just put it in the chat, but one of
Yes.
the other things, as you're speaking about being creative, is also I think has been helpful, at least in my case, is when you do have co-investigators or in other individuals on your project, and you want to show collaborative work, or also sort of knowledge of how you work well together. Sometimes the work that may be aligned with what the project is, but not necessarily exactly related to the project, could also potentially be helpful in that section. What are your thoughts about that?
Oh, I love it. I mean, for me, I think, for me, here's one of the things that I think. I think when you get your feedback back, right? When you get your summary statements back on a rejected proposal, I think oftentimes like the best thing to look at is that first paragraph, the summary of discussion. If you don't have one of those, look at the summaries from each of the reviewers. If investigative team is mentioned in that, I think that that's an important thing to address. I often write like they don't have a track record of working together because you have to write something for every like element of the proposal, but it doesn't really mean that much to me. And so it's not in my paragraph because it's not a score driving factor. It's just one of the things that I think they could do to sort of beef it up. That said, and you'll see from the slides here, like the studies can come from any member of the research team. And I do like the idea of like we as a team, like in sort of preparing this proposal, we've sort of come together not only to, to pull together this sort of like juggernaut research idea, but we've also sort of taken the initial steps to sort of like I keep saying the word catapult to like, that's because I'm like, I got like a one-track mind, but like, we have brought together this team and we're actually taking the preliminary steps to get this idea, to get the ball rolling on this idea. So I do like the idea of the team having sort of some deliverable already in progress so that is kind of a non-issue. So yeah, I like that. And I do think that one of the things to know is that as you're indexing, you really should be indexing from every member of your team. And I think sometimes we can be really intimidated by the fact of like existing teams, with an already existing project and like they have this like huge database and they've already all been working on it. But I think that, sometimes there can be a strength to pulling people together from a diverse set of fields who've worked on the same project, but from different angles or through different lenses. So I do like that. Yeah. I would do the exercise. I think I probably won't do it now. If we have time at the end, we'll probably come back to this, but I'd like to leave some time for questions. So I think Rochelle is going to pass along a set of activities I did in a suite to this workshop for a different group where we just went through and discussed different ways to do this, because my big takeaway here is going to be that there really isn't like a right way to do this. There are like several right ways to do this, so long as what you end up with is the perception that the project is less risky than it sounds sort of at first blush. So some decisions to make before you begin. Does it make more sense to include your pilot data as a single section or beneath each aim? I don't really have an opinion on that. My preference and how I do it is always one big section at the beginning. But that's because I really believe that research projects should look like one single objective divided into 3 steps rather than 3 separate projects that coalesce loosely under a theme. But that is not to say that that's all that gets funded. Like different things get funded in different ways and different fields have different traditions. And so I don't want to poo-poo any particular field, but that's the way I do it. But oftentimes if you're doing, 3 separate lab studies all under a particular theme and they're sequential, but also interrelated, I think you can have something that says, maybe you're doing like a mouse model, a pig model, and a human model, right? In those cases, it might not make sense to, at the very beginning, begin with mouse, pig, human. That might feel like too much to do in a single section. And that might seem like a fairly arbitrary sort of division, like, what the subject was is not necessarily the right division of like the procedural sort of like advancements or the scientific advancements within each population. So it might make more sense in a situation like that to do aim 1, pilot data demonstrating proof of concept or feasibility, and so on and so forth. Because I think porcine, however you say that, models can be a little more complicated, and they're like, so they have like smaller populations, you use fewer pigs than you use mice, and so you might want to go through like each one and have different different pilot data sections for each of your aims. right? So this might be a tradition in your field. And oftentimes, here's another trick of the trade. Always be writing a grant proposal with somebody else's grant proposal, somebody else's successful grant proposal beside you. Don't plagiarize anything, but there's no shame in plagiarizing the structure, right? If they included a section on pilot data here and you want to try that as your first go, absolutely. I say that for method sections, it's huge. The structure of a method section can be so persnickety and difficult to pin down. And so if you have a successful one by your side and you use that to construct a reverse outline, they use population and then they use data collection, they use data analysis, and they gave like a paragraph for each or 2 paragraphs under analysis. I think that's a fantastic way to write a grant proposal. It's how I started writing grant proposals, because I think there's no use in reinventing the wheel. And sometimes that can help you capture like what is expected in a grant proposal in a way that trying it, de novo as like a first timer, you might forget. Does it make sense to move from study to study, right? If you have 2 different pilot studies, does it make more sense to move that way, or from concept or feature to concept or feature, right? Does it make more sense to go conceptually, here's the innovation, and here's the pilot data that we have to support it. Here's the methodological innovation, and here's the pilot data that we have to support it. Some people, if they've got some groundbreaking work in a particular area, want to go study to study. Other people want to pin it concept to concept, and I think both are fine. How much space will you allocate to your pilot data and to each concept or study? And this is a big thing in everything you write. Everything you write academically, airtime is a function of importance, right? If it's a big study but it has very little to do with what you're actually doing, like it's a groundbreaking new, not groundbreaking, it's like the first like seminal study in a particular area, but it doesn't really have anything to do with what you're doing, like cite it and move on. If it's newer, but it really speaks to what you're doing, how you're doing it. I mean, whether this is a lit review, whether this is an academic paper, whether this is a grant proposal, airtime is always a function of importance. The importance of that research to what you're doing. Resist the temptation, this is my favorite one. Resist the temptation to simply present success stories. This is something that I see a lot. It's like, we did this and we did it. It was successful and it was so good and I'm a great researcher and, so you can trust me with your money. I don't think that is what you're going after, because that does very little to de-risk the actual subject material. And I think sometimes if the topic and if the topic is too well aligned and then the project was super successful, then the question becomes, why are we redoing this project? If it holds for 100 people, I don't know that the best sort of argument is, now let's see if it holds for 1,000, right? I think usually the best thing to do is say, the 100-person project demonstrated clear proof of concept, but with 1,000 people, we could determine the following. We could add dimension, we could add variables, we could add nuance to our understanding. But 100 to 1,000, that being your entire pitch, I think doesn't promise progress in a field in the same way. So avoid the temptation to just pick studies where you were really successful. Sometimes too, you could be like, we set out to discover this one thing, and in our analysis, this other thing emerged as much more important. And so this is sort of the direction that we now need to take our work, right? I think that's a great way. I think it shows a lot of insight. I think it shows nimble research. I think it shows a willingness and ability to adapt your research to what the data is telling you. I think it makes you look like an overall sort of solid researcher. I don't know that this is super interesting, but I wanted to include it anyway because not that it's not super interesting, but I don't think we need to spend a ton of time on it. How about that? But what I love is a really well-structured study if you're taking the study by study approach or concept by concept, start with a short title or subheading, right? A brief statement about the research objective of that study, something about the research. How many people did you use? Core procedures and methods, results, deviations, or lessons learned, and then avoid the temptation to be exhaustive. That's goes back to sort of the preening. Like, we don't need like, pages and pages and pages on what you did. I think you want to speak to like, this was a rigorous study and the results are trustworthy, right? But here's how I would put that together in a pilot data section. So Project X, a case for data collection feasibility. Lead off on, don't bury the lead, right? This is going to show you that data collection in this area is feasible, period. Project description, and I just use some, boilerplate verbiage there. Methods, results, and then this is my favorite part, a little 2-sentence relevant to the current proposal. What did we learn in here that speaks to the feasibility or lack of risk in this present proposal? So if you take one thing away from this talk today, hopefully you take away more than one thing, but if you take only one thing away, I think this as like a template for how you might get started presenting your pilot research. Like if you have numerous studies and you're going to go study by study, tell them what the study is going to demonstrate for them, and then tie it back into the objective of the current proposal. So far, so good. Let's see. So these are some examples. I think, let me see. Sorry, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 is good. We can do this in a couple minutes because I really do want to leave time, and I never leave as much time for questions as I want. So consider subheadings. So this is like when you talk about your like main takeaway, right? What does the study tell you, and how does it link back to methodological feasibility, right? And methodological feasibility might be your retention rate, right? Our 90% retention rate between waves 1 and 2 shows robust follow-up capacity and evidence of participant engagement. I would love to read that as a reviewer. If I knew you did 2 waves and you're proposing subsequent waves and you're going to build on that, I would say a 90% retention rate. That's pretty good. Like that does show me that the team is following up well, that you have a lot of buy-in from participants. Like I would love to read something like that. Promise or proof of concept. Preliminary analysis showed that participants who completed the intervention reported consistent reductions in perceived stress, suggesting the expected directionality and informing power estimates for AIM-1. Also something that I would love to read, right? You know what you're studying, you knew where the gap was, you knew what I was going to raise my eyebrows at, and you're speaking to the feasibility of that specific thing. And then opportunities for growth. This is what I'm talking about when I talk about like too much of an alignment between like what you did and what you're doing, and too successful of results. Like where are the opportunities for growth, right? In moving from 100 to 1,000, and moving from second, 2 waves to 3, 4, 5 waves. What are you going to learn that's new, right? I think sometimes it's like, what were the results? What were the findings? What's the advancement in knowledge? But then it's also like, what did those advancements in knowledge raise by way of novel questions, right? Because I find that the most novel questions can often be raised by people who have done work in a particular field because they know sort of, like they have the insights from previous work in that field to know sort of what's been done, and then sort of where we're going, and sort of where the biggest sort of opportunities for advancement are. So let's see. And then this is kind of another thing. This is like a strictly formatting thing, but like, do you want to include an introduction or a conclusion? Are they worth the space? Because an introduction can provide a brief lay of the land. It can remind your readers of what we don't know. It can remind your readers of the risky parts of the proposal. But if you're going to remind them of the risky parts, you better make sure that you can address those parts, because otherwise you're spoon feeding them the critiques that you will definitely see in your summary statements. A conclusion can also be an amazing opportunity to just recap. So based on all this stuff we've done, we now know that we've got sort of the proof of concept and the springboard for the type of research that we're proposing. This is another thing. So space allocation is a big deal. And I think a lot of us sort of wonder about like how much space should we be sort of allocating to these different things. If you look at the NIH website, they say 25% of your proposal should be what is it called? Pilot preliminary data. Like the website says that. And I'm like, I don't know that I have ever seen anybody put that much pilot or preliminary data. One person, but she had done a lot of work in this area. So it was definitely, I think, worth the space for her. But mostly I would say what I typically see is like a page and a half. Oh, wait, let's see. Yeah. What I typically see for an observation, as an observation R01 is about a page and a half. Because you have to remember, every time you include something, you're waylaying something else. You're taking the space up that you could have used on something else. So I typically tend to see, even in big sort of beefy R01s, I tend to see about a page and a half. But really, you kind of use enough string to tie the package, right? If you have more risky elements, if you've done more work, if you raised a lot of questions in your initial submission and people really wanted clear proof of concept, and you might err on the side of the 2 pages or even above that. But really, I think I think 3 pages is like way up at the max end of things, and I think my guess is that if I were to read that proposal, I would be left with questions about your methods. But that's what's on the NIH website. Observation wise, even in the most successful proposals, a page and a half is usually like the top end. But don't be surprised and don't be shy about demonstrating your project's likelihood of success. One of the things, this is my favorite story. It's actually somebody affiliated with the C2 Dream Center, and so it's good that she's not here. But I remember reading one of her proposals as like a reviewer, and she had done this pilot study looking at vaccine hesitancy in particular populations, Somali populations. And when she'd done the study, she said, our results indicated triple the uptake in vaccines as the control group. It was amazing. And where I found that was like on page 7, right? The page where your eyes glaze over and you're just waiting for the proposal to be done. And so for me, I was like, no, like that's amazing. Like tripling the vaccine rates of a particular population, tripling anything in any context, anywhere is amazing. So for me, I was like, you can make time, even in your AIMS page, our exciting, groundbreaking preliminary data indicated triple the uptake in this population. So you're priming your reviewer right at the outset that you've got preliminary data that suggests really wild success of this intervention. So I think you can use this in the AIMS. If it's conceptual, like if you're using conceptual proof of concept preliminary data, you can use that in the significance section, in the innovation section, in the approach, and I've given you sort of some mention, some opportunities or poop. So I think, I don't know. Let's see. I kind of got ahead of myself. Yeah, AIMS is usually a cursory mention. Significance is more detail. I almost never see it in the innovation, but if it's methodological, it's often in the approach section. So, yeah. Preliminary. So for this one, I would say there are some pitfalls, right? There are some times where your preliminary data suggests that like it might not be the most useful sort of buttressing of your current proposal. That doesn't mean to not go after the funding. That doesn't mean to not write the grant. It simply means that this might not be the project that you use. So even though you've done work in the area, it might not be a right fit for buttressing what you're proposing, specifically if your preliminary data contradicts your main research hypothesis. Like you don't want to use that and say, well, we're not sure why, and we're going after more money to determine why that is, unless you can make a case that like proven or disproven, like that's going to really advance the field. And even then, like if somebody's got something in there that says, yeah, we didn't find what we were looking for, but we're going to go after it again, I'm usually like, do you need it? Can you use it in a different way? Can you use it to say that we collected all the right data? But if it's going against If it's going against the grain, I more often than not, my recommendation is to leave it out. If it doesn't sufficiently de-risk your project, I mean, if for example you have like a 40% retention rate, like that's another thing that you probably just leave to the side. Methods or measures lack evidence or validation. I mean, I think these are fairly obvious, but I think what people don't always know is that you're not obliged to keep, just because you've done work in the area doesn't mean you're obliged to include everything that you've done. If it's not helping your case, just leave it out. Right? Nobody's going to come checking, have you done this? Did everything work out exactly the way that you were supposed to? If you as a scholar, as a professional, as an expert in this field believe that you're taking the right direction and you have the evidence to support that the direction that you're taking, I don't think you need a comprehensive, exhaustive sort of list of everything you've done in an area. You just want to sort of weave together the story that helps your reviewer to see what you see. And so often I tell people who I review for all the time, like, you have to sort of take off your like supplicant, like hat in hand, please can I have some money for my research, and more put on your teacher hat, right? What do you need to know in order to understand why what I'm doing is the next logical step for our field? So yeah, I mean, I think, 12 minutes. Good job, Jude. I really wanted to include just a little bit of time for like just any questions that you might have. I mean, I know that some of this very much stands to reason, but a lot of this is going to be like discretionary, and so in the exercises that I gave Rochelle, a lot of this is about like, how do you think through this? How do you make decisions about this? How are you judicious? How do you effectively preen? Because a lot of this, I mean, everybody here is a scholar in their field. Everybody here knows how to do research. Everybody here knows why they've made the assumptions and picked the directions that they have. And so a lot of this is about communicating how you did that as an individual and as a scholar. So there are as many ways to do that as there are people in this room or people presenting pilot data sections. So is there anything that like kind of gives you trouble, or are there any questions that you have about sort of what we've discussed so far?
Thank you so much, Jude, for that presentation. Any questions for him? Jude, what about, you were mentioning the idea of, be thoughtful about how much space you're dedicating to various, studies or concept based on the importance and relevance to the study. Do you also include at the end of some of the studies that may potentially be not necessarily as important, but could potentially highlight someone's ability to do something or to carry out a methodology or expertise in an area as well? Let me just maybe give you an example. If the project is really on mixed methods, and you're bringing an example of a study in the preliminary section that sort of is related to a mixed methodology, and saying this study highlights the PI's expertise in these areas or familiarity with conducting this type of methodology, would something like that also be helpful or important as a reviewer, for example?
Okay, so I have some thoughts on that. I did a panel of panelists one time, and what's very funny to me is what was great. I think the best thing to emerge from that is that each panelist had something different that they said, I really hang my hat on this section of the proposal. So one person was an obesity researcher, and she was like, it's got to be innovative. I have to see a good innovation section because obesity research has been done, and a lot of it has been done. So what are you doing to add to the conversation? She said, I don't really care about the investigative team, and gave her reasons for that. Another scholar said, innovation wise, I don't need novel innovative methods. I don't need really what I'm interested in is who did they pull together from various disciplinary backgrounds to meet the needs of the project. And so I think different people see this in different ways. Personally, for me, where I would expect something like what you're talking about, Mandana, is I would expect that in an investigative team section. One of the foibles of the investigative team section, which I really dislike, is like person's name and bio from the website. Person's name and bio from the website. What I like when I review and what I try to do when I write with various levels of success, sometimes it's not so great, but I try to do this, is talk about this project sits at the confluence of three different, methodological schools of thought or something like that. We've pulled together a team of experts in each of those three areas. And, this person has done work in this with this project as the evidence, and this person has done this with this project as the evidence. So that's kind of where I would see something like that maybe fitting a little better. Because I think, but I do think that there is an element too of like de-risking the investigative team. So if the team has worked together, but I think where I would probably, if I were reviewing a grant like that, like as like an editor, I would probably encourage the person to take that section and pull it into the investigative team so that it's mostly concepts and methods in the pilot data section, and the investigative team sort of sat apart. And that's the same thing with like if the team has worked together, those are the types of things that I would look for an investigative team section to sort of demonstrate the aptitudes and expertise of the team. That's probably what I would do.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. Is there anything too? We can just talk more about stuff that, or you know what I can do? Okay, I'll talk, but interrupt me anytime. Let me see. There is poop. How do you get out of this? There we go. Okay. Nope. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to show you some of the exercises that we did for this like follow-up session. So let me see if I can find these. Stop sharing PowerPoint, presentations, pilot data workshop session 2. This is so that you know that I'm actually doing something. If you want to like keep moving through some of this and use some of these as thought exercises, this set of slides, pretty much goes over what we already went over. But what I liked about this and thought was kind of fun is what were they trying? So there's different things that like, so these are both from, I think they're both from my, from funded grant proposals of mine. But it's an opportunity to read over like a snippet of somebody else's pilot data and to ask yourself, what were we trying to demonstrate? Was it procedural feasibility, measurement quality, signal effect detection, team capacity, or something else, right? What do you see that we were trying to do in this proposal? And how effective were we, right? Is it good? And with me not there, you can say, no, I don't think that's very good. But they were funded proposals. So, it's an opportunity to see like, what sort of carried some weight with reviewers. And they're on two different aspects of technology and aging, which tends to be where my research is. The second one is like a template for writing out your own pilot data section, right? What's the aim? What do you imagine would be the biggest reviewer concern under that aim? What's the evidence to address that reviewer concern? What would work, and to what extent do you have it, right? So creating that little map for yourself along with the rubric that I had in the previous slide might help you to get through that page and a half, because I find as a writer, I don't deal well with like blank page syndrome, like a flashing cursor on a blank page. I don't like that. But if I have little sections to fill in, that at least gives me some text that I can start to work with. So I'll free write around those things, and then I'll preen and edit, which is something that I am good at, right? I'm not like building something from nothing is not my zone of genius, but I'm a pretty good editor. Yeah, so that was an exercise. And then this one is one of my favorite ones. ChatGPT helped me on this one, but I wrote up an aim based on, a confluence of different proposals that I'd worked on. And what I did then is I had ChatGPT build 5 pieces of preliminary data. And what we talk about is if you can only use 2, which 2 of these are you using? All of them speak to some aspect of the project, but some of them speak to multiple, and some of them line up really nicely. So we did that twice. And then we work on that like takeaway sentence. So looking back again at the first presentation with the like, what did we learn from this? Like, here we go. Here's your opportunity to sort of take something that you've done and practice writing that 2 sentence summary. What can we take away from this pilot data? And then, yeah, I think that's it. I think that's all we did there. So just thought I would sort of give that as a something for you to take away from the event.
Very helpful. Any other questions from the group? Okay. I know Rochelle's just put out an evaluation. Please make sure that you fill this out. And Jude, we really appreciate and are truly grateful for the time that you've taken to put this together, but also bringing in the perspectives of the pilot awardees as they have been sort of working on these projects, thinking about, how to utilize their data as the next step. I know that's been tremendously invaluable, and I'm sure everyone benefited quite a bit from your teachings. Thank you again for all that, and I think we can probably end our session if there's no other questions
All right.
from the group.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much.